He travelled around the world and lived among them, working alone most of the time. He learned their language, created a writing system, preached the good news, and translated scriptures. But after 6 years, relatively few people were interested, and no church had been formed, even with a tremendous prayer of faith in recent months. And Fraser had an invitation to serve elsewhere.
Perhaps this is not God's time. Is it right for me to stay on, waiting and praying, when workers are urgently needed in more fruitful fields?
What happened to James O Fraser and the Lisu people will surprise and inspire you. London University, 1906. A 20-year-old British honours student was looking forward to completing his final year in the engineering programme. His career plans were steady. But on this day, he was reading from a small booklet with a challenge that spoke to his heart.
If our Master returned today to find millions of people unevangelized, and looked, as of course he would look, to us for an explanation, I cannot imagine what explanation we should have to give.
This little booklet really made an impact on my father. It went to the heart of the biblical command that Christians are to go into all the world and preach the gospel to everyone. The angels were not commanded to do that. Only Christians are commanded and are answerable before God for whether they've obeyed him. He couldn't shake these words off.
The book spoke of renouncing obvious plans because God had something better. Should he give up engineering and go into the mission field?
James O Fraser, cum laude.
Fraser said goodbye to his mother and joined the China Inland Mission, the interdenominational group originally founded by pioneer missionary Hudson Taylor, also from England. A great admirer of Taylor and his emphasis on living by faith, James Fraser arrived in China in 1908 and began to study the Chinese language. After a year or so of preliminary study, he was prepared to be sent to the remote regions of China, ready or not.
Yunnan province is way out in the west of China, and in the western part of Yunnan there are a lot of mountains. It's very rural, and that area had very low priority in the mission's thinking. But they needed help, and China Inland Mission's John McCarthy, who was in charge of the ministry in that region, he chose Fraser from the language school to join his team. Not knowing that Fraser had a real love for the outdoors and was also an experienced mountain climber.
He was in his element. He loved mountaineering. He'd been climbing in the Alps with his cousin, and these mountains were even higher.
When Fraser first arrived in Yunnan province, he was welcomed by the W.J. Embry family. They were the senior missionaries in the area and lived in a town which was then called Tingyue. He continued to study the language, really, and just focused on immersing himself in the local community so he would really understand their customs and their culture. Then on market days, he would just walk into town, and it was there that he noticed tribal peoples coming into the city from the surrounding mountains.
Minority groups like the Shan, the Jingpo, Lisu, and Tibetans often came from surrounding areas. Years later, missionary Isabel Kuhn wrote about Fraser's encounter with these tribal peoples.
These people did not speak Chinese among themselves, and they did not dress like the Chinese. They wore turbans, and their clothing, especially that of the women, was very colorful. The Lisu tribes people had never heard of the Lord Jesus Christ, and the language had never been reduced to writing. They were not idol worshippers like the Chinese, but they worshiped their ancestors and spirits of nature.
One day, Fraser found a group of Lisu tribesmen in the marketplace. With heart beating, he invited them to the little room he called the preaching hall.
They followed him gladly and entered the room, and then prostrated themselves on the floor and knocked their heads on the ground 3 times, out of respect for this white-skinned stranger. This is traditional.
While language differences limited their time together, Fraser was surprised at the immediate affection he felt for these people.
Right from the beginning, I was very much led out in prayer. Something seemed to draw me to them.
Fraser was now able to use his Chinese language ability to communicate with many people, and he took trips across the mountains to distribute literature and share the good news about Jesus.
Well, in one town, James met a silversmith who showed immediate interest in the gospel message, and so invited James to preach in front of his shop. James enthusiastically agreed to do this, of course, and so crowds came. They just gathered around. They'd never heard a white man speak, and they were just enthralled with his message. It was not even remotely like anything they'd ever heard before. After many days of doing this, Fraser was finally exhausted and just needed to go off and be alone, so he went up into the mountains.
I realized that no missionary had ever lived there, and the whole plain, with a population of perhaps 100,000, was without the light of the gospel. It does seem a terrible thing that so few are offering for the mission field. I can't help feeling that there's something wrong somewhere.
About a year after J. O. Fraser arrived to the area, he set out on foot westward with a Lisu guide. They came to a small village and were excited to discover they were holding a betrothal ceremony that evening. Fraser added to the merriment by being unable to speak a word of Lisu. But when he started jotting down sounds on paper, they seriously wondered what he was doing.
One of them complained, "He's taking away our language and we'll have nothing to speak."
By the end of the day, James had secured 400 Lisu phrases using the English alphabet. While this speaking paper provided entertainment for the villagers, it was the beginning of the first written language of the Lisu, which others believed could not be written down. The Fraser script is still the official written language of the Lisu people.
Well, after several years of working by himself, Fraser was finally joined by a missionary colleague. This was a young man from the United States by the name of Carl Gauman. Fraser and Gauman really hit it off. They had plenty of energy and loved working together. One day when they were in Fraser's home, there was a knock at the door. Fraser opened it to see a Lisu tribesman standing outside.
This man had a gift for him. He'd caught a beautifully coloured bird from up in the mountains. He wanted to present this bird, and he wanted to borrow some money for a family wedding. He also invited them to come to the wedding as his guest.
James was in somewhat of a quandary. He'd never lent money before, so he invited the man to talk with Carl while he went to his room to pray about it.
After prayer, James agreed to go to the wedding. He gave the man the money and said they'd be there.